can imagine.
Yeah, we certainly can. Please give a very big warm welcome to Channel 4 news presenter Cathy Newman. So, Cathy, obviously you've had a really hectic morning. We've got a bit of a repeat delay going on here. But hopefully
Sorry,
that's
is that
not...
me? Is
I
that
don't
my
know
tech?
if it's you. I'm just looking over at our tech
Do you need me to
team.
mute myself when I'm not speaking?
No, I think we're fine. Oh, I think it's gone now. My dulcet
Yeah, I
tones.
just muted myself. Is that better?
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. So obviously you've had such a busy morning, and you are the first female news presenter at Channel 4. Before we talk about today's events this morning, can you take us back to talk about your career background?
Of course, and just tell me, I'm muting myself when I'm not speaking, but if I don't need to do that, just tell me, because no doubt at some point I'll forget to unmute myself. So, but yeah, just in case, is that sound quality okay for you?
Yes, it's on my end, I think, when I...
Is it right? Okay, I won't bother to mute myself. I'm in the newsroom, so it's quite busy. Obviously, I would love to have been there in person, and I'm really sad not to be. Normally on a Wednesday, I would be in Leeds, so I'd be there. And I know we scheduled this deliberately with that in mind. But because of the US election, I'm not in the US, sadly, but my colleagues are. And so I'm having to be in London doing the kind of like holding the fort here. So thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm sorry not to be there in person. So, yes, in typical politician fashion, I've now not answered your question. Your question was how I began my career, right? So, gosh, God, how many years ago was it? Wow, I'm 50 now. So we're talking 30 years ago. I did some work experience on a local newspaper. And I know local newspapers now, sadly, are a sort of much depleted force. But this was a fantastic experience because it was in North Devon. It was this tiny little newspaper. They didn't have very many staff. So the work experience kid, which was me, was sent out to report on any stories I could lay my hands on. And the news editor had tipped me off about this murder investigation that had been launched by the police in a very dramatic location, which was a clifftop path in Lynmouth, which is a very picturesque little village by the sea. It's a real sort of tourist spot. It's called the Valley of the Rocks, if anyone's been there. And blood had been found on a clifftop path, and so police had launched a murder inquiry. And what I found out doing a bit of digging, calling the local police, calling all sorts of people locally and just sort of hanging out and getting to know people, was that it wasn't human blood at all, but it was the blood of some wild goats. And what had happened was that the local council had gone out at dawn without telling anyone, without consulting with local people, and they'd shot a whole load of the wild goats in this picturesque clifftop location. And their rationale was that the wild goats were getting too plentiful and they need to have a cull. But, you know, the local people hadn't been asked. Animal lovers were up in arms, and it caused this whole furore. And obviously then someone had tipped off the police, and there had been a murder investigation which had clearly gone nowhere because there was no murder involved. But, you know, that story was picked up. I put it in the North Devon Journal, and it was then picked up by the Mirror and various other newspapers. So that was my first scoop, as it were. And it taught me quite a lot, that scoop, because it taught me to find out all sides of the story, that the story may not be what it first seems. And it also taught me about speaking truth to power and holding power to account. And that is what you're there for as a journalist, that, you know, people on the ground might be really pretty exercised about the fact that someone in authority has done something that they shouldn't have done. And my job as a journalist is to sort of ask questions of those in power. So that was my first foray into journalism. I hope that answers your first question.
Thank you. And in terms of getting that break, that first foot in, how did you go about getting that?
Yeah, and it's funny because my daughter's at university at the moment, and she's just starting that process of looking at what she wants to do afterwards and how to get a job. And I just know how tough it is for everyone at the moment at university and just trying to, you know, find their way in. And people like my daughter are writing hundreds of letters, trying to, you know, emails probably now, I should say, just, you know, banging on doors, trying to get that first foot in the door. And that's essentially what I did as well. I wrote to all sorts of newspapers. I applied for TV traineeships. I applied for the BBC traineeship, the ITN traineeship. I didn't get any of those. And so, you know, my first foot in the door was literally that kind of hard scrabble of just writing to every local newspaper I could think of that might have me. And the North Devon Journal said yes. And so I suppose there's a lesson in that, isn't there? That sometimes you look at the kind of where you want to be and how you want to get there. And it seems like an incredibly tough mountain to climb, but you can start in the foothalls and gain that experience, and just by sheer sort of persistence and not taking no for an answer, you can work your way up. And once I got that experience in the North Devon Journal, I was then able to use the experience I'd got and finding stories and writing stories to then get onto a national newspaper. And at that point, things sort of snowballed and I was kind of on my way.
And you specialised, didn't you, in media and politics? How important do you think it is for trainees to, specialise in certain genres?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll just get rid of the notification in case that makes a noise. I think for me, it was definitely helpful to develop an expertise in a particular area. So I went on to a national newspaper, The Independent, as a researcher. And I actually left after 6 months. I had a 6-month contract, and I'd been hoping to kind of build that up into, a sort of reporting job. But they were incredibly strapped for cash. They didn't have the money to properly train me as a reporter. So I took a bit of a gamble and joined a trade magazine called Media Week, which no longer exists. But the advantage of that was I spent a year and a half there developing a whole load of contacts in that area of kind of media and business. And with those contacts and getting a whole load of scoops, I then managed to jump back from there, back to The Independent as a media business reporter, because I developed that expertise. So I think specialising in a particular area and becoming a real expert in that area, I think it's really good, it stands you in really good stead. So I then went from The Independent, being a media business correspondent, I got poached by the FT, and I spent 8 years on the FT. So I developed a really detailed knowledge of business, media. And then while I was doing media business, I got really interested in politics, simply because at the time I was reporting, there were a whole load of media mergers going on. There was lots of kind of business activity that involved media companies trying to get approval for mergers. Brussels, Westminster politics came into play, and I found that really fascinating. And so that's where I got my first sort of interest in politics. And from there, the FT sent me down to cover politics, and then that's really what I've specialised in ever since. And actually, funnily enough, when I first got the idea of going into journalism, I wanted to be a war reporter. I saw a reporter called Kate Adie, who was a kind of veteran war reporter on the BBC, probably the first woman to do that kind of job. I saw her reporting on the first Gulf War, and that was what gave me the idea to go into journalism. And I always say, well, I never made it as a war reporter because I got too interested in politics, and I just sort of that was where my interest then lay. So maybe one day I'll be a war reporter, but at the moment I just find the world of politics too fascinating.
We'll come on to that shortly. So what sorts of challenges have you seen along the way on your joint career?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the first thing to say is that, as I've alluded to, opportunities don't come easy, and I know that's absolutely the case now. I know how hard it is to get your foot in the door and to get a job. It's incredibly competitive. So that's the first challenge, isn't it? It's just not being knocked back by rejection. I suppose the second challenge that has been a sort of persistent theme, and I've ended up reflecting on this in my books, is when I first entered journalism, it was an incredibly male-dominated world. When I went down to Westminster, for example, for the Financial Times, I was one of the few women in the room of newspaper journalists. The politicians themselves, so there weren't half as many female MPs, let alone peers, as there are now. And I always remember there was a peer who shall remain nameless, but one day I'll name him, who, when I invited him out for lunch one time, he sent me a text back saying, I'll come out for lunch with you if you wear those really nice lace-up black boots that you've got. And so you were constantly being sort of bombarded with these quite sexist messages. And it was the same in the media world, to be honest, as well. You know, I remember one time I was in a bar during party conference season, and a national newspaper editor, it was about 2 a.m. or something, because you end up drinking pretty late in those kind of settings. And I was always told, obviously, to keep my wits about me, because you're trying to get stories, and you don't want to drink so much that you forget what the story is, right? So I always ended up being quite sober while a lot of people around me were getting quite drunk. So I'd be talking to this national newspaper editor and excused myself, said I was going off to bed, went upstairs. A few minutes later, the phone rings, and it's the national newspaper on the phone and saying, can I sleep in your room, because my chauffeur's disappeared and I've got nowhere to sleep for the night. So there's always this sense that, you're in a male-dominated world. I got chased around the office at my first magazine job, Media Week, by a guy in sales pinching my bum. It's that kind of sexism, harassment. I would say that's the biggest hurdle for a woman on her way up the ladder, as I call it. And, I've done a book recently on the ladder, which is talking to women who made it to the top of the ladder and the hurdles that they've overcome on the way. And it's really striking that so many of the obstacles and hurdles that have come in my way, that's something that many other women on the job have faced. And particularly, I think, women of colour. It's that whole business of intersectionality, that you've not got just the one obstacle, but the other obstacle too. And that just redoubles your challenge. But I suppose I want to be optimistic, because actually, since I started 30 years ago, things have changed dramatically. And there are far more women in leadership positions. There are more women of colour on screen and behind the scenes as well. And I think the sort of bigger challenge now is actually a socioeconomic one, that it still remains more challenging to get a foothold in the world of media if you don't have the contacts, the network, if you're from a less well-off background. And I think that's the business that we need probably to address more now.
I wanted to touch on some of the language used. So obviously you say it's improved and got better, but you have commented about language used when it comes to headlines, predominantly more lenient towards men than women. Boris Johnson, Nicola Sturgeon. Obviously, with this morning's news with President Donald Trump in the USA, there's surely going to be a general impact on the news agenda across the world on the back of such derogatory comments and languages.
Yeah. Oh, you're really echoing back now. I hope you can hear me okay, my end. Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Clearly, one of the first requirements of my job is I've got to be impartial. That is public service broadcasting. You can't let your personal agenda show. So that is the first thing to remind myself this morning, waking up to the news of Donald Trump's victory. I suppose the second thing that sprung to mind is that this is an extraordinary story. A convicted felon everybody counted him out, a while back. And he rebuilds himself and achieves this astonishing victory. That in itself is an incredible story that, we as news reporters, it's a kind of you can make it up moment, isn't it? And I think that over the next few years, this is going to continue being the story, the gift that doesn't stop giving for journalists. However, on a more sober note, this is an incoming president who joked about, training his fire on journalists. So journalists are going to be targets. He whips up his followers to target the news media. And I think this whole business of fake news started, that was a term that he coined. And our battle to be trusted as broadcasters got that much harder in his first presidency. And I think that's going to be the same in his second presidency. However, again, being optimistic, I think people, particularly, my kids' generation, probably about the same age as a lot of you in the audience, my oldest daughter is 20, my youngest coming up for 16. They don't sit down and watch Channel 4 News at 7 o'clock in the evening, I'm afraid. And I'm sure a lot of you don't either. But so our challenge is to get our trusted content out in as many different platforms as possible, so that people do know that they can trust us, that, you know, we're a bulwark, if you like, against a lot of the fake news that genuinely is fake news that circulates online. You know, you've got Elon Musk, who will be a figure in this second presidency. And you look at Twitter or X now, and I'm sure, you know, like me, there is a lot of that you know you can't trust. So public service broadcasters, I think, have a more crucial role than ever. So there's an opportunity there, but we have to win the trust and confidence of people who are being told by the incoming president that, you know, you can't trust the fake news, you can't trust the public service agenda. So I think in the UK, we have this really vibrant public service broadcasting industry, you know, obviously ourselves, but also the BBC. And you've got, you know, some incredible reporters on ITV too. So it's our job now to get our content out, that we know how hard we work to bring in that investigative news. And, you know, we've got phenomenal reporters and presenters that really, you know, we work so hard as a team to ensure that what we put out is trusted and credible and authoritative. And I think the challenge now is just to make sure that we get that out on as many different platforms as possible.
I wanted to ask you about your interview style, because it's not pugnacious like so many other interviewers. And, you know, it can have really good benefits by being slightly less formal and aggressive. How's that evolved for you over the years?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think when I started presenting, you know, I grew up with, well, actually, funnily enough, I didn't have a telly when I was growing up, which is kind of ironic given what I've ended up doing. But when I did get a telly, you know, and became interested in TV news, my model, there was Jon Snow on the one hand, who, you know, I used to watch when I was at university, and I can't believe that I ended up presenting next to him. It just feels like a dream come true, to be honest. And he had authority, but he also had warmth, and he also had that authenticity, but he didn't badger people for an answer. So there was that on the one hand. But I also grew up with that Jeremy Paxman kind of, you know, what was it? I think it was 12 times he once asked a question of the Home Secretary in a previous Tory administration. And that, in a way, when I started presenting, that was what I thought you had to do as a presenter, kind of badger politicians relentlessly to get an answer. And I think over the years that's evolved, because although it's true that in order to get an answer out of a politician, you have to be very determined and incisive, and you've got to interrupt them, because you've got a 4.5 minute interview and they could talk for 4.5 minutes in a single answer if you let them. So you have to interrupt. But I think the difference now is that I realize that viewers, a lot of the time, they don't want people shouting at each other. They don't learn anything from that. So my role is to try and have a civilized conversation. I'm not going to let people off the hook, but I'm also going to try and interrupt politely, firmly but fairly, so it doesn't become a kind of shouting match. So I think my style has evolved over the years. And as I realised that really it was kind of a bit of a zero-sum game, sort of shouting at each other. And I hope that also, I think the advent of podcasting and the popularity of podcasting tells us something in the mainstream media, because people want that kind of detailed exploration of the subject. They don't want to feel that someone only has 4 minutes for an interview. So one of the reasons I started my radio show is on Times Radio on a Friday. Drive 4 till 7, do tune in, is that, you know, I've got then 3 hours to just explore a subject or a big breaking story. So I'm not having to hurry people and get them to do sort of 20-second soundbite answers. So I've evolved, but I also think the broadcasting media has evolved too.
And which platform do you prefer broadcasting from, or covering? Podcast, radio? I've listened to the radio programme, by the way. Great.
Thank you very
Or
much.
television, news. What's your favourite? Or writing books?
Well, I do think I feel very fortunate to have a sort of taste of all of them, because I love TV. You can make an impact with a scoop, for example, on TV in a way that you can't on any other platform. But equally, there are shortcomings of a 1 hour TV show. Yeah, I feel so pleased that Channel 4 News is nearly an hour every night, because that's a rarity in today's news media. But on the other hand, there are shortcomings to even having, to squeezing your scoop or interview onto that format. It's quite a rigid format. So I love doing my radio show for having that expansive time. But I also appreciate that I don't make as much impact with my radio interviews as I do with my TV ones. So I kind of like to have both. And then the books. I love writing. I've always loved writing. I spent, well, it must be 10 years at least on newspapers. So I don't want to quite let that go, because again, you've got a sort of freedom to express yourself and to think about exactly what words you want to choose and how you want to phrase yourself in a way that you don't on live TV or radio. And then, within that, just to add, within that Times radio show, to have that half-hour segment, which is the ladder, which I also put out on a podcast for subscribers to the Times. It's every week to speak to a kind of household name woman who has achieved extraordinary things in her career. I love doing that, and that was the basis for my last book, The Ladder, that's just been out nearly a year now.
And also, having listened to The Ladder, I would say as well, it's so much more relaxed, isn't it? Just like informal conversations over a cup of tea with such amazing household names, and really informative. We touched on resilience before, and it's horrendous to think about the wrath you've received online with online abuse and death threats on the back of certain interviews. How have you
Yeah.
managed to deal with those?
Hang on, I've now realised I've got these the wrong way around. Just finally, is that actually better? Can you hear me better on that? I realise I have those on the wrong. You could hear me anyway. Okay, great. You're talking about the Jordan Peterson interview and the aftermath of that. Yeah. I mean, the thing about that interview is that, I always get asked about it, fair enough. And it's one interview out of hundreds I do every year. So that kind of puts it in context for me. It's the only interview that I still get trolled about to this day, which is kind of frustrating. And, the trolling was pretty extreme. It was death threats, people sending pictures of knives dripping with blood. I was doxxed, which I'm sure everybody knows. My home address was put out online, which, given I had teenage kids, was not great. And I've had stalkers as well, so to have my home address out there wasn't brilliant. So that was a difficult time, but I think also there is I've developed a resilience over the years, and I kind of care so much less now. And I also look at the abuse so much less. I don't really look at Twitter or X that much. I'm kind of busy sort of working my contacts, getting my stories, focusing on doing a really great interview that night. I don't have time to sort of engage in the sort of spats on X. And I think a lot of journalists spend too much time doing that. That's certainly not my style of journalism. It's not what I want to spend my days doing. But yeah, you do have to develop a resilience. But I always ask myself, I know after all these years, and I didn't know this at the beginning of my career. Of course, I didn't know what I was going to go on to do, but I know now that I've achieved a lot of things that I want to achieve. Still more to do, of course, but you can be confident in your position and your achievements. And so actually, does it matter what some kind of random, unknown person with an egg for a face says about me online or wants to plop into my email box? I honestly care so much less than I did. And that's not to say it doesn't hurt, because of course it does. But I think you have to, the more you do, the more you achieve in your career, the less you care about the kind of brickbats from random trolls.
Thank you. You talked about contacts there. Out of interest, how many contacts from your early days of your career do you still go back to as sources now?
That's a really good question. And, it's interesting because you'll talk to different journalists and you'll get different, everybody has a different way of doing the job. And, some people do get a lot of stories on X or online. And I do get sent some stuff online, but I suppose I'm a little bit old-fashioned in that a lot of my best stories are because I've nurtured contacts over many decades. So to give you a random example, when I was a media correspondent, I think it was even media reporter at first on the FT, And I had to deal with a PR a lot on one of the big media companies, Carlton Communications. And that PR was David Cameron, who many years later ended up being Prime Minister. But I kept in contact with him. So I had that, that level of contact that enabled me to sort of get a foot in a door, get interviews, know all the people around him. So that is incredibly useful. So I think working your contacts and meeting contacts, having a drink with people, going out for lunch and having a, off the record, really insightful conversation about what they know and what's going on. I think that's actually something that a lot of journalists now, because they're under a lot of time pressure on deadlines, they don't have the time to do. And I think that's a shame, because that's how I get my stories and that's how I stand up my stories. And, also, even if it's not necessarily a story, but just some insight into what's going on behind the scenes in government or what's happening in the shadow cabinet, that is, for me, it's all about contacts. And that's the way I do my job. And I'm not saying that's the only way to do the job, but that for me is the kind of tried and tested.
And which story are you most proud of, the story that you've broken?
Well, this is interesting, because I'm actually working on a scoop at the moment that is a sort of follow-up to a story that I broke 7 years ago. And I can't say anything about the scoop at the moment, but 7 years ago, it was the best thing, actually. I got just a letter, which actually had gone, first of all, to Channel 4 headquarters, and it taken quite a while to wend its way around the system to me. And it was just a letter saying, can we meet? I think I've got a story about the Church of England. And so I met this guy thinking it's probably nothing, but, and he was a bit taken aback, because it had taken me so long to answer him, because the letter hadn't reached me for so long, that he thought I wasn't interested. Anyway, I met him. And he handed over a report into the most horrific abuse of boys and young men in the Church of England. They were beaten until they bled. They were beaten so hard, some of them, that they had to wear nappies. And this guy who'd done the beating was a senior barrister and friend of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So with the investigations team here, I put together a really detailed sequence of reports. And this was abuse that happened both in the UK, but also he went on to abuse in Zimbabwe and South Africa as well. So three different countries. And we put together this report. I'm so proud of it, because those victims had been living with this for nearly 40 years by that point, and it had destroyed their lives. And with incredible bravery, they decided that they would speak out about this, because they'd never got justice. And although I don't think they've got justice even now, because the abuser, John Smythe, died actually in about a year after our report went out. But they do feel at least that they've been heard, and that the church has at least, the church has commissioned an official inquiry into what went on. So they have got an audience and a hearing that they didn't have before. So I feel really proud of that. Likewise, I feel really proud of a story I did about a paedophile who was a British man who'd gone out to Kenya and, under cover of a charity, had abused hundreds of kids who lived on the streets in Kenya. Terrible story. Again, really, these are dark stories that I do, but as a result of that, he got jailed for many, many years. So I'm really proud of that. And on politics, again, I'm afraid it's another sort of abuse story, but Lib Dem peer Lord Reynard a victim came to me, wrote to me, and said they wanted to speak. And it actually took 3 years from her writing to me getting the report out, because there were so many legal obstacles to getting that report on air. And in the end, at first it was kind of dismissed. The Lib Dems were in government at the time, and it was kind of dismissed as a little bit of mild sexual harassment. But it kind of snowballed. And I look back now and I think that it was a classic Me Too story, years before Me Too ever happened. So I feel proud again that I was sort of there. I'd spotted something that was an injustice that needed putting right, this terrible abuse of power and harassment in Westminster. So I feel very proud of that as well. I'm proud that, in a way, those victims who came to me started the ball rolling on a broader reassessment of how women are treated in Westminster.
Thank you. I think we're going to go to some questions now.
Great.
From the audience.
Good luck with the echo.
Is the echo unbearable? Fairly
Not
unbearable.
okay. It is. Thank you so much for joining us. It's privileged to hear from you. Working still? Yeah. So my question is based around you mentioned sexism and adversity, especially for females and females of colour within the industry. What advice would you give to young journalists or new journalists going into the industry? And at any point, did it make you just want to give up?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I never wanted to give up because I'm quite stubborn. And I think I just always had this sense that, going back to, as I said, seeing Kate Adie in her flak jacket reporting on the first Gulf War and just seeing her and thinking, it's that old expression, you've got to see the change to be the change. I'd never seen a woman doing that kind of job in journalism before. There were news presenters who read the auto cue, but they weren't sort of doing gritty reporting out in the field. And so to see her doing that, I was like, wow, yeah, that can be done. And so I think I never looked back from that moment, because however hard it is, however many obstacles or sexist harassment, all of that gets put in the way, I thought I had a right to be a reporter and to be in that world, just as Kate Adie did, and she sort of blazed the trail for me, really. But yeah, it is. You've got to be resilient, and in a way, I think the way you learn resilience is through experience. And just like, when I first started presenting, having been a correspondent for many years, I didn't really know what I was doing. And, I made mistakes, because you do make mistakes. And I still make mistakes. We're all human. And I think the only way you learn to deal with mistakes is by failing again and failing better, as the saying goes. So it's about experience, it's about flying hours, it's about carrying on doing the job. And yeah, sure, you'll have setbacks, and you've got to be resilient. You'll have things thrown at you that set you back, but you've got to be able to come back from that and just get back on the horse. And so I'm mixing my metaphors terribly here, but one time I did a story for the FT that I had a really good source for. It was one of the, years and years ago, the Chancellor's special advisor had briefed me about something that was in the budget. And for the FT, there couldn't be a bigger story. So I did a front page story about this. And unfortunately, the special advisor had been playing games with me, and the story wasn't true. This particular proposal was not in the budget. And I got into quite a lot of trouble with my bosses. But again, so, mistakes, you make mistakes and you learn from your mistakes. And I learned, of course, from that you've got to, no matter how good the original source, you've got to have multiple sources. You can't check too carefully about getting a story right. So you learn, and there are times when it doesn't feel comfortable to be the, butt of abuse online or whatever. But I think the longer you go on, the more confident you become about what you've achieved, looking back and taking the long view. I think that's really important, not to be sort of weighed down by crap getting thrown at you on a day-to-day basis. You've got to look back at what you've achieved in the long run and where you want to go, what more you want to do, and focus on that. Don't focus on the noise and the kind of ugliness of the moment.
Hi, Cathy.
Hello.
Hello. So you're a real inspiration. Thank you for existing.
Oh, that's nice.
I would have so many questions, about your love for history, for example, or about the election news and the impacts that you think that will have on women. But as you don't have much time, and I've probably only got one question, otherwise it would be really cheeky. I just want to ask you about your toolbox. So I think you're probably one of the best interviewers on television at the moment in terms of your range. So, if an interview is necessary to be sort of very ardent and objectionable, then you are right there and persistent in trying to get the answers. But when there's a victim or somebody else like that, you really softly kind of coax the answers out. So I just wanted to ask about your toolbox when you prepare for it.
Yeah, another really great question. I think I'm always putting myself in the position of the viewer or the listener, because I'm not here, I'm not on screen or on air to talk about myself or to big up myself. I'm there as a conduit for what people watching or listening want to hear. So I'm always putting myself in that position. So, that's that's the first tool in my toolbox, to use your analogy. So, if you're talking to, a rape survivor, for example. I remember one interview I did years and years ago with an 18-year-old rape survivor who wanted to waive her anonymity because she wanted to raise awareness about the position that a lot of teenage girls are in, and their fears, and how they don't get justice from the justice system. It was incredibly brave of her to waive her anonymity. But obviously, in that situation, what does the viewer want to hear? They want to hear her story. They don't want to hear me sort of challenging her, or it would be completely inappropriate. So I sat back and just let her speak. So that's obviously, that's the kind of tool that you need for that. And you need empathy, because how are you going to know what the viewer wants to hear unless you think your way into someone else's head? That's a crucial tool in your toolbox. And I suppose then the other thing is to give an example. Last week I did an interview with the Chancellor straight after the budget. What does the viewer want to hear there? Now I'm thinking, the tax burden. A lot of people feeling pretty cash strapped at the moment. They want to know, is there a justification for taxes going up? So I've obviously got to be very persistent on that. I could see there was a big opposition growing to the tax on for farmers on inheritance tax, change on inheritance tax. So I knew I had to get something in on that. Then obviously there's the bond markets. Is this going to be another Liz Truss moment? How are they going to react? So the challenge there is, I was told I had 7 minutes and that's all. And I have to get all these different questions in 7 minutes. But I've also, she's not brief, Rachel Reeves. So she could have taken literally 3 answers and that my whole 7 minutes would have used up. So there, I've got to interject as politely as I can, but as firmly as I can, because otherwise she's going to, be perfectly fine for her if I only get 3 questions asked. She wouldn't mind at all. So obviously a very different approach. If I'm interviewing an 18-year-old rape survivor, I'm going to make sure that I have an hour to do the interview, and we go very gently. We start very gently. I spend a lot of time acclimatizing her to the interview before, the cameras go on. I make sure she knows what are the implications of doing the interview. Is there going to be a sort of social media repercussions of her doing it? Have I got the proper permissions? Here's a camera operator, this is what he or she, where he or she is coming from. This is the venue we're going to use. You've got all these extra considerations. You're going to take a lot of time. With Rachel Reeves, it's about, I spent so long preparing that interview because I knew I had to be incredibly nimble to get through everything I wanted to get through and make sure I pressed at the right time and then moved on at the right time as well. So, in other words, what you've got to have in your toolbox is empathy, ability to listen, agility, persistence, but I think also firm but fair. I keep coming back to that. And I think Jon Snow was really, really good at that. He knew when to push someone and when to just hold back and just be a human being. So maybe that's you got to be human. You're the viewer's representative. So I'm not there for me. I'm there for the viewer.
Hi, Cathy. I want to thank you for everything you do on Channel 4 News, because I personally think it's the most globalistic of the linear news channels that are still today.
Thank you so
Also,
much.
my question is more about how we engage younger audiences with traditional media forms, particularly in an age of Snapchat and TikTok.
Yeah, very, very good question. And that is what really occupies us, and more importantly, occupies my bosses, because it's no good us producing this amazing journalism day in, day out. And thank you for recognizing that. We're rather proud of it, but it's great to hear that from a viewer as well. But yeah, so once we've done our amazing investigative reports or incredible interviews or, whatever we've got, we've got to get that out, as I say, on every platform. So it's hard because we're a small operation compared to the BBC or something like that. We are small and we don't have vast resources. So our online team is incredible. So everything we do gets repackaged for different platforms. So YouTube, we do a lot of longer form videos, whether we do some of our Gaza reports, for example, go out on our YouTube channel. So we're getting that audience. We also do cut downs for Instagram, for X, and for TikTok. So we're all over that. WhatsApp, we've just started doing WhatsApp alerts. I have to check what we're doing on Snapchat, actually. I'm not sure that we do Snapchat at the moment, and maybe that's a miss because I know my kids are on Snapchat as well. But it is about getting out there. And I know, for example, my youngest, who's nearly 16, is quite a good focus group for me because she comes to me having seen a lot of BBC stuff on Instagram. And I'm like, okay, why isn't she seeing our stuff? Because, she should be absolute classic target audience for us. So we've really got to work at that. And it's no longer just obviously about our 7 o'clock hour-long show. There is still, every night we'll get, maybe 500,000 viewers on that, more when it's a big news day. So that's incredibly important. But increasingly, it's about how we repackage all the content that we do for the night show, and also new content as well. And I've been involved in a lot of the forecast podcasts that we do. I mean, I guess they're really vodcasts actually, because it's put out on YouTube really and Twitter. But so it's less of a podcast and more of a kind of video podcast. But that's something that we do exclusively for YouTube, and we'll trail it on our 7 o'clock show, but we're really appealing to a whole different set of viewers. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. But yeah, we have to, and I think there is an opportunity because a lot of stuff that's out there on TikTok or on X, for example, I think people now, younger generations, know that they can't trust what they see on X or TikTok. So I'm hoping that the more that becomes apparent, the more people gravitate to the content that we're putting out, even though they might never watch the 7 o'clock show in their lives. Hopefully there'll still be a need for journalists like myself and my colleagues holding people to account and, bringing in great stories.
Thank you. We've got one final question now.
Hi, Cathy. And yes, I
Hello.
do watch news, and it's great that we share a same hero in Jon Snow. So my question is, do you think that trust for the mainstream media is under threat with the rise of social media, independent news sources, and also AI has made it more difficult to fact-check information?
Yeah, I do think, it's slightly, similar in a way to the previous question. I do think it is a huge challenge, definitely. Getting those, in the past, when I started in TV, we had maybe over 1 million viewers a night. And that was a kind of guaranteed audience that tuned in pretty religiously every night. So that's kind of easy. Now we're having to search for the eyeballs. But on the other hand, we have the fact that we've got so many different platforms can also be an opportunity. It's a challenge and an opportunity. But there was a second part to your question. What was it? Sorry, now I'm forgetting. TikTok. It was... AI. Yes, AI. I think, again, I don't want to sit on the fence. I think there's a huge challenge from AI, of course. I did several films on deepfake porn, AI porn, that unfortunately in investigating this whole area, my investigative colleagues found out that I'd been deepfaked, and there was a deepfake porn video of me that I didn't even know about. So, there's an obvious... that is a huge challenge to us as human beings and as journalists. I mean, when I contrast how I find information now to how I found information when I first started out, when I was a researcher on The Independent, so my first sort of proper national newspaper job, I was given the task of every day I had to do a sort of information box to accompany the news analysis that we did, a daily news analysis. It was spread over 2 pages, and all I had to do was this little box. So it could be maybe the news analysis was on tourism or something, and I'd have to do top 10 tourist sites in the UK, and I'd have to find that out. It's laughable now. Like, do it online, it would take literally seconds to find that out. Then I would have to phone round lots of different sources, you know, UK tourism bureaus, to find out the answer. And there'd be lots of conflicting information, and I would have to collate it. It took me the whole day. And some days I couldn't even find the top 10, it would have to be the top 5. So now that can be done in minutes. So in many ways, AI makes our jobs as journalists easier. But there is this huge issue, as you say, of trust and what's true and what's not. So yes, we might find certain bits of our job are easier because of AI. Others, for example, sourcing picture from Gaza, for example, there's a whole load of, there's so many fake images out there that we've got to check and double check provenance before we put out those images on our content. So, I mean, I would probably say it's a net negative. AI and social media, it's probably a net negative for our job. I think there's
We just lost you slightly.
so many challenges facing journalism, not a downer, but I think there's a bit from seeing it as a
Thank you so much. Can we please give a very warm round of applause? Cathy Newman, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.